I'm Jane Sparks with the Montana Book Festival, and it's a very fun afternoon we have here with two of our favorite people, Annick Smith and James Lee Burke. I'm going to be turning this over to Lois Welch to introduce them, but please take a second, you know the drill, get the phones out, shut them off. All right, and I think we've got everybody in. I may go ahead and close the door so we have it quiet in here. So thank you all for coming and enjoy the afternoon. Lois, turn it over to you. Oh.
I'm Lois Welch, and I have known these two writers since I came to Missoula in 1966. Yes. Actually, we were all born in the same year. Is that right? I've never before introduced two pre-publication authors. Annick's book is officially out next month. However, the publisher has sent 40 copies, really hot off the press. And James Lee Burke's book is due in December, though he has a copy, luckily for him. Right. Annick was born in Paris of Hungarian parents and grew up in Chicago. She and her husband David moved to Seattle, where he got a PhD in English at the University of Washington and became friends with Richard Hugo, the poet. This is not an official autobiographical fact, but crucial to Montana history. In 1964, both Hugo and David were hired at UM, and they all moved to Missoula. First, Annick and Dave and their two sons lived in town, then moved out to Valley of the Moon Ranch on Rock Creek. They gave wonderful parties. I met my husband at the opening day of fishing season party in May of 1967. This may not be official biography, but it's crucial to my corner of Montana. After their European sabbatical and the birth of the filmmaking twins, they bought the ranch above the Blackfoot River. After David's death in 1974, Annick stayed on the ranch and raised those four strapping sons. She had been a book writer for the University of Washington Press and a high school teacher. Now she became a writer and film producer. In 1976, she and Beth Ferris produced Kicking the Loose Gravel Home, a lovely documentary about the poet Richard Hugo that rarely gets mentioned. Her film Heartland was based on Eleanor Pruitt Stewart's Letters of a Woman's Homesteader, and she was co-producer of Robert Redford's 1992 adaptation of A River Runs Through It, and also of Peacock's War. She is a founding board member of the Sundance Film Festival in Utah. In Missoula, she founded the Hellgate Writers, a literary center, and has participated in innumerable workshops and conferences. You've probably been to many of them. She and Bill Kittredge edited The Last Best Place, that whopping, groundbreaking 1988 anthology of Montana writers, whose editorial board itself read like an anthology of Montana writers. In addition to her books, Homestead, The Big Blue Stem, and In This We Are Native, Annick has published numerous articles, poems, and stories in such magazines as Outside, National Geographic Traveler, Audubon, and Story. Crossing the Plains with Bruno is Annick's most recent book. I just got a chance to peruse it last night after persuading Barbara Theroux to pry it from the box in the basement. It's a joy. The best kind of memoir, alive with observation, reflection, humor, and the lifelong swirl of love and loss. Oh, and there's a dog. That's according to our friend, the writer Beverly Lauer, who said that so aptly in her blurb. You will love it. Now please, let's take a pause for reorganizing seating and then have Annick read.
Anyone who wants to sit on the floor?
You want to come up here and sit on the floor, anyone? Anyone under 60 is welcome to the floor. Anyone over 60 will be applauded if they sit on the floor. Lily, come on up.
Folks over 60 want to come and have a chair.
Tilly.
This is reserved for granddaughters only.
And granddaughters can leave anytime they get bored.
All right, are we all settled now? Well, there's 2 seats right there. Come, somebody. Come. Nobody wants to admit that they're uncomfortable yet. You'll regret it. Okay, will you please now welcome Annick Smith?
Thank you all. I'm so honored to be here with Jimmy Lee Burke, who is one of our dearest and oldest friends. And I do mean old, we are all old. Anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to start reading some bits and pieces from this book, which is made up of bits and pieces. I'll start with a preface. The poet and novelist Jim Harrison has said he measures the passage of time by the dogs he has had. So do I. The worst thing about dogs, Jim also said, is we outlive them. Hopefully not much longer. Having passed the 75-year mark, both Harrison and I are ready for the moment when our pooches will outlive us. If not this batch, surely the next. And being the lost instead of the loser may be a good thing. Let them cry over us. Writing about animals, said the poet Mark Doty in his memoir, Dog Years, is an attempt to bring something of the inchoate into the world of the represented. This is an impossible task. We who tell stories about the animals we love are trying to bridge the void between beings that live full lives without language as we understand it, and those of us immersed in words. We know the gap cannot be bridged, and yet we are compelled to give it a try. It is like writing about love, which Doty says is our most common version of the unsayable. Dogs may or may not be aware of the fragility of their humans, but we owners of pets are aware of the predictable mortality of our animal companions. Such knowing does not stop a lover of animals. Loss, we have learned, is the price of love, and love is what we are after, no matter the pain. Which brings me to Bruno, the chocolate lab, who will be a major character in this book, my companion on the journey that is at its core and one of the loves of my life. Bruno, there he is. Bruno was 4 years old when this story began. He weighed 95 pounds and had functional testicles. His head was massive, his eyes yellow, and his muzzle soft and pink. Russet at the ears with fur colors deepening to chocolate brown, he was tall for a lab and strongly muscled. Although Bruno could seem fearsome, especially when charging straight at you with his neck fur raised, he acted like a giant pup and would remain mellower than any dog I've had, to the point of marshmallow-dom. Bruno loved people, especially young women. Also Kevin, our neutered black cat, who he tried to bugger. He was a talking dog, making moaning sounds, high-pitched and keening or low and guttural, which he expected you to comprehend. Like Chewbacca, my son Alex explained. I looked blank. The big hairy creature in Star Wars? Oh, the lovable monster. Although I don't equate parents with pets, the pattern of loss is similar. To paraphrase Harrison, the worst thing about parents is most of us outlive them. Having lost my husband, Dave Smith, when I was 38, and my father in my 60th year, I felt lucky as I turned toward 70 to have a mother nearly 100 years old. I had not always been so grateful. Mom died of chronic pneumonia 3 years after our road trip and 1 day short of reaching the age of 101. We buried her ashes next to my father's in a patch of lily of the valley and red columbine on the dune overlooking Lake Michigan next to the cottage they had shared for more than half a century. And Bruno is gone too. Before this book was finished, his brown snout had shaded to white, and his great paws were also spattered white. He was hip-shot and slow to rise, a condition we shared on dark winter mornings. His backbone stood out, but his stomach was large and hard to the touch. When I took him to our vet, I insisted she examine his stomach. Only then did we discover he had a huge tumor attached to his spleen. Bruno went under the knife the next week. The tumor was 10 pounds, but not malignant. The vet called to tell me Bruno was up and alert and looking around. That made me happy. A couple of hours later, my phone rang again. "Your dog's dead," said the vet. "Dead," I shouted. "What happened?" "I don't know," said the vet. "Bruni's dead," I screamed. "Dead." Bruno is the dog star of this story and essential to my narrative. While driving across the vast spaces of the interior West, I often got lost in memory or flights of fancy. I skipped a part. I was going to visit my mother in Chicago. She was 97 years old, and I decided to drive, taking 2 lanes with Bruno as my companion. And that's sort of the core of this story, or the spine. Bruno's presence and his needs forced me to return to the actual. He reminded me that I too am an animal whose existence depends on being alert to the scents and sights and hungers and emotions of the moment. Through constant company in an enclosed space, I had hoped to inch closer to understanding this dog's way of being, observing my mysterious animal as the cave people observed theirs. Fascination with animals being as old as our species, and the inspiration for our first and perhaps greatest expressions in art. I only partially succeeded. I learned that dogs have memories, instincts, fears, moods, loyalties, and hatreds. They are like us in those ways. But as far as I know, dogs do not get swept up in nostalgia, speculation, or self-analysis. And although they have hopes, they are not driven by regrets, which is why in a story narrated by a woman beset by the processes of aging and the imminence of death, the dog who rides shotgun is, like Sancho Panza to Don Quixote, a reminder of the physical realities outside our imaginations. He is a connoisseur of scent trails that branch sideways or backward, uphill or down, always serpentine from any straight path. I cannot know what advice Bruno would have offered if he were instructing me about how to write this book, but I like to think he would tell me to follow my nose. Life, he might say, bounds like furtive, delicious rabbits across every step of our way. So now I'm going to read you a little piece about Richard Hugo, who was a great friend and actually the reason that I ever came to Montana. And this happens on the first day of my trip to Chicago, and it's called Divide. Swooping down from the Continental Divide along Lewis and Clark's Trail on Highway 200, I leave the evergreen forests on the west side of Rogers Pass and descend to wind-struck plains. The change in topography is startling. On the west side of the pass, the road winds steeply upward through pines and brush, looking down to a sunless canyon where dark houses huddle on patches of grass. Over the top, I'm struck by light and space. Rain-shadowed plains open to the horizon, and a highway taut as a stretched rubber band runs uphill and down, but always straight ahead. I can see for miles and see no cars or houses, only the muted wash of spring grass, cows and coolies, buttes rising in the distance, a few horses, snow fences, weathered shacks, and the wide blue heavens above. This road takes me back to a summer day in 1977. I was shooting a film with my film partner, Beth Ferris, trying to document Dick Hugo's life in a movie we'd call Kicking the Loose Gravel Home. The film opens with Dick driving these roller coaster hills, heading for his wife Ripley's cabin in his pine green 60s vintage Buick convertible. You remember that one. The top is down, his balding head shines in the sun. He hums to a Benny Goodman tune played loud on the tape deck. Hugo was as close as family to me and my husband Dave. Our friendship began in Seattle around 1962 while Dave was getting a PhD in literature after giving up a career as a lawyer. Drawn by Hugo's poems about the undersides of what was then a bland, middle-class city, we connected with Dick's humor and his empathy for the disenfranchised. More important, Dave and Dick shared nearly identical histories. Both had grown up poor, fatherless, and left behind by young mothers to be raised by grandparents at the margins of society. And both were self-created men of letters, different in looks, personality, and habits of living. They recognized their brotherhood. My connection was more female. I fell in love with Dick's voice, his warmth, his rhythms, his words. It was sexual attraction without the sex. I was an editor at the University of Washington Press at the time, a young mother trying out her wings, when an encounter with Hugo changed all of our lives. The month was July, the year 1964. Just back from a month in Italy, Hugo sat across from my desk where I was checking page proofs of his poems in the anthology 5 Poets of the Pacific Northwest. "I've quit my job at Boeing," he said. Dick's laugh was infectious. There would be no more technical writing for this poet. I'm going to be a professor. He rolled the syllables, relishing the word. There's a job for an English instructor. How'd you and Dave like to join us in Missoula? Drinking heavily and abandoned by his first wife, Barbara, Dick was often morose those early years at the University of Montana, and so were his poems. But there was light in his darkness, for in Montana, Hugo discovered a landscape filled with forgotten towns and the forgotten people he identified with, also back alley watering holes he liked to call home, open prairies to get lost in, and rivers filled with willing trout. Happiness of a different kind arrived for Dick a decade later. Under his doctor's ultimatum, quit or die, Dick quit drinking. He met and married Ripley Shem, a Montana plainswoman and poet, and through her gained a son and a daughter, a dog, horses, a ranch-style house on Rattlesnake Creek, and Ripley's log cabin on the Teton. "I am good enough to own a home," Hugo proclaimed in At the Cabin, a poem that celebrates his marriage. Home was no longer bars or the loveless shack in White Center, Washington, where he grew up. Home was a place he could own, like other professors and businessmen in silk suits. By 1977, Hugo had achieved national recognition and was writing and publishing as never before. "He is getting full of himself," said Bill Kiltridge, who had become my lover and companion a few years after David died. Bill was mourning the bad boy camaraderie he and Dick had shared during Dick's drinking days and was wary of the limits of domestication as well as the dangers of self-satisfaction. "What's wrong in being happy?" I countered, knowing full well that happiness comes and happiness goes. Dick was equally aware of the pitfalls of success. His psychic homeland kept calling him back, as he wrote in the only bar in Dixon, to the old ways of defeat. Beth and I filmed Dick in his childhood home in White Center, the working men's suburb west of Seattle, where he'd imbibed those self-defeating ways. But we were more focused on his Montana successes. We could not know that a few years after we finished our film, Dick would booby-track his own good luck by plunging back into hardcore drinking. Then, vulnerable from radiation that had gotten him through lung cancer with one good lung, he was stricken with leukemia. When I called him for the last time in his Seattle hospital room, Dick and I chatted about the World Series that he and I were watching on TV. And he joked about the color of his skin. "You know that old jingle about a purple cow I'd rather see than be one? Well, that's me," he said. "I'm that purple cow." Dick rides with me now, these cascading grasslands bringing flashes of his round head and furrowed brow, the sensuous mouth set between grimace and grin, the bear-like body at rest. And his voice comes back to me too, riveting, deep, rocketing. I open the window and recite the words of Driving Montana, the poem that opened our film so many years ago. "The day is a woman who loves you," open, "dear drink close to the road," and "magpies spray from your car." If the poem were mine, the enamored day might be a man, perhaps a child or dog. "No matter," Dick had said, "it's being loved, loving, that's what counts." I smiled to myself, wondering if Dick had withheld a wink at those two easy words. No matter. The afternoon is sun gold. The Rocky Mountain front rears sharp as a pen and ink drawing on the horizon west. Deer graze along the Dearborn River, and magpies spray from my car. The grasslands that surround me are newly risen, and yes, Dick, open. I want to shout to the wind, to the sun, "Goodbye, life as usual, I'm truckin'." Okay, this is a little section of a piece way further down the road as I get into southwest Minnesota. And it's called Verdi. And it's about my father. I have crossed into southwest Minnesota on the Laurel Ingalls Wilder Highway and feel the Midwest like rheumatism in my bones. The land changes from plains at Volga to rolling croplands pocked by lakes and ponds and patches of hardwood forest. I'd like to detour to Verdi, a few miles off on a side road, a town even smaller than Volga. I assume it was named by an opera buff like my father, Steve Deutsch. I try to imagine him striding across the plains as an immigrant settler, but can't. Mom was the strider. My dad was a seer, a listener, a wiry, dark-haired, attentive fellow with a prominent nose, brooding brown eyes, and a sensuous mouth. He was likely to lurk in an alley with his camera or position himself on a bench in the square where he could watch for the perfect, lonely bench sitter. More often than not, he'd make friends with his subject, the turbaned holy man in India, or the old Greek woman leading her donkey, or the bleached blonde at the Beanie Weenie in Chicago. Pishta, as he was called, a nickname for Istvan, which translates to Stephen, was all his life a street kid, pugnacious, curious, hot-blooded. I knew his character, but not much of his personal history, because he told us very little about his childhood. Like many Jewish immigrants from Central Europe, he wanted to be born again as an American, which meant leaving family stories of hard times and persecution back in the old country. This is a story that we're very familiar with right now. Having little factual history, I made up a story imagining my father in a Hungarian version of Warsaw's ghetto, a crowded quarter of pogroms and segregation like those I'd seen in Holocaust movies. When he read my interpretation of his early life in one of my first published essays, my father laughed. Pasht, he said, had a Jewish neighborhood but did not have a ghetto. You've got it wrong, all wrong. I grew up in the heart of the city, on the main street. It was like living on the Champs-Élysées or Michigan Avenue. Michigan Avenue? I could hardly believe that story, but I found it was true when I traveled to Budapest after my father died. The apartment building on Andrassy, where he had grown up in a crowded janitor's apartment with his father, mother, and 2 older brothers, was located in the swinging center of Hungarian culture at its fantasiacal apex. The State Opera House was a block away, and the theater district 2 blocks up the avenue. I imagine my father and his brothers roaming the neighborhoods from Hero Square to Museum Street and the old university quarter by the Danube. They loiter outside cafes where intellectuals congregate, swipe oranges from outdoor markets, play pickup soccer, and gape at the theater crowds. In an era when street life was a main source of communication, these 3 sons of a Jewish janitor picked up ideas and fashions and visions of the arts that would incite each to become an artist. Pishta, my mother tells me in one of her favorite stories, loved to stand outside the opera, catching drifts of melody that wafted through open side doors on warm evenings. Once your daddy threw out his shoulder, he was conducting so hard, she laughs. My father never grew out of his conductor phase. I see him in our living room in Chicago and later in our house in Wilmette at ease on Sunday mornings. The stereo is tuned up to a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart concerto or a Bach string quartet. Pishta is wearing a worn, checkered flannel shirt. He has not shaved. His eyes are closed. He is humming or whistling or singing bits of melody. His arms move vigorously to the music. As I drive between Volga and Balaton, I flip through my CDs and find Verdi's Requiem. The music begins, the requiem soars. My father's face appears in my mind. His eyes are shut tight and there are no lines of age or experience to mar the white mask of his visage. A vision of death-like rapture that duplicates exactly the plaster mask he made of himself as a young sculptor in Paris. Song fills the Toyota. I roll down the window to let out some of the sound. I turn the volume up. Here comes the Désiré. The day of wrath, that day shall dissolve the world in ash. I push the repeat button. Lacrimosa dies illa. That day is one of weeping on which shall rise again from the ashes the guilty man to be judged. Lacrimosa, tears. My father's face dissolves in tears. He was a man not ashamed to weep. Music could move him to tears at home, but also in a crowded concert hall. I would sit next to him in orchestra hall at a piano recital or string quartet and observe the tears coursing down his cheeks. Self-conscious and inhibited by social norms, I cringed at his display of pure emotion, wondering why I was not moved to such extremes. Pishta, stripped naked before me and the entire world. I can think of no syllables more suitable as tribute and lament for my father than Verdi's Requiem. Spare then this one, O God. But his longtime friend and lefty fellow traveler, Studs Terkel, offered a different kind of tribute. Studs spoke at my father's memorial service in 1996 in the chapel of the University of Chicago, where I had married Dave Smith in 1955. Master of the bon mot, fluent and needing no notes, he characterized my father precisely. Well, this is Steve Deutsch. It's no accident he was a close and dear friend of Nelson Algren, because both of them were pursuing the world beyond the billboards, that lone person on the park bench, the anonymous out there. There was Budapest, there was Paris, but Chicago. I quote Nelson Algren, Steve's closest friend, being part of Chicago is like being married to a woman with a broken nose. There may be lovelier lovelies, but never a lovely so real. And that's Steve's gift, catching the realness, the truth, no matter what. Now, do we have time for another little bit?
Sure.
Huh? Okay, all right. Now, this one is about my mother, sort of, and me. She retired to a high-rise old folks' residence after my father died when she was 90 and began a whole life. She lived to be one day short of 101. So she was 97 when I made this trip. Safe harbor. Bruno handles himself with aplomb this morning, walking into the empty elevator from the 32nd floor with no resistance. But it is later than I had planned, and the breakfast crowd is at its peak. On our way down, the elevator stops a dozen times for elders going to breakfast or heading to exercise classes. A pretty African-American nurse's aide steps into the elevator, spots Bruno, utters a cry, almost drops her tray, and jerks back as if burned. We thread through the lobby and reach the revolving exit door without barks, growls, or knocking down old folks. The wind off Lake Michigan is a Windy City slap in the face. It whips around the semicircular entrance to the breakers and wakes me out of the funk this warehouse for the elderly brings on. I realize I've been holding my breath. Why does this posh high-rise infect me with stress and fear? It haunts me in deeper ways than intensive care units or nursing homes where dying is imminent and visible. Bruno pulls me through the tunnel under the outer drive that links the Breakers Park to the lakeshore. It's all been thought out. Flowering trees, green spaces, the ever-changing lake she loves are as easy for my mother to access as the dining room where she eats breakfast and dinner. Tomorrow she will take me by the hand and lead me to her favorite bench by a crabapple tree. The tree is full of birds. I'm not an expert and it's too dark to tell what they are. Perhaps nutcrackers or blackbirds, an occasional crow. When the sky turns purple, the birds will rise noisily from their branches and fly upward in a V-shaped formation. That's when the jets come screaming overhead, contrails marking a sky path over the lake. See, says Mom, the birds are showing the way. They are telling the airplanes where to go. She studies the air and nods her head. It's my secret, she whispers. I watch the birds every evening, and every evening they are here, and when they have done their job with the airplanes, then they fly away. I wonder if my mother is losing her mind, or if she is simply escaping into a personal mysticism rooted in the natural world. Here is her bench for meditation, a patch of grass, some flowers, and a tree that offers an opening to the secrets of birds. Perhaps Mom dreams of flying away with these birds, flying as high as a jet plane, flying far from the glass box that offers her shelter but little comfort. I can't know what my mother thinks, and I don't want to upset her by asking, but I keep digging into my own fears and come up with one plausible answer. The breakers threatens me because it makes the process of letting go be so comfortable, communal, inevitable, and banal. This is where you will give up on life, whispers every molecule of its filtered air. This is the place where you come to die. We enter life screaming and gasping for breath, hungry for a mother's touch, the breast, the milk that sustains us. It irks me that so many of us will have to leave that life in a state of passivity, drugged with the inevitable, if not with morphine. My mother understands her predicament and has chosen it. She knows she might end her 100 years in this alien yet comfortable place, surrounded by strangers or alone in her rooms, the television on with no one listening. Stop this rant, I tell myself. You have no right to feel holier than thou. Most of the dwellers in the breakers have chosen to retire here. They have dreamed and saved to find safe harbor in a shiny glass building along the lake. a retreat where there'll be no cooking and cleaning. Let's see. No worries about property, no tedious, stressful jobs or family duties. In such a haven, a person might relax, wear pretty clothes, enjoy a social life with peers, watch gulls dive into blue waters. When my mother was my age, she would have laughed at the idea of living in a retirement home. No, she would have said, no, no, no. But things change. Like my mother, most of the people who reside at the Breakers are widows or widowers. They don't want to live with their progeny or be a burden to them. They have chosen limited independence and a community that offers solace, if not hope. A recent widow will find new friends here. A widower might find romance. In this fine place, he tells himself, there will be no more loneliness. Loneliness can be the greatest fear. It is not mine, at least not now. When I am no longer capable of driving, I believe I'll choose solitude on my mountain meadow. I will want a dog or two at my feet and a caretaker to shop, cook, clean, and drive me to town to see family, friends, and doctors. Until my mind or hands or eyes no longer function, I will want a word processor, satellite TV, and CDs playing my favorite music. There will be a stack of books by my armchair and a telephone at hand so I can talk to my children and grandchildren and surviving friends. Most day I will sit near a window, as I am doing now, and look out at the sweep of grass and forest and cumulus clouds, pewter, pearl, dove gray. Like my mother, I will chart the courses of migrating hawks, of bluebirds and robins and turkey vultures dipping on black wings over Bear Creek Canyon. And I will drift into sleep as she does, feet up, head back, mouth open, and gently snoring.
Wow.
Do we need to have another reshuffle? Are we okay? If we don't need to reshuffle, let's not reshuffle. If any writer in Montana needs no introduction, it'll be James Lee Burke. I continue unnecessarily. He has written so many books, 22 I counted, so many of them bestsellers, and won so many awards that reading the list could take up the rest of our time together. His publicity picture shows him in a big old cowboy hat, I should say a big new cowboy hat, with a beautiful blonde horse, to which he is not whispering. His newest book, House of the Rising Sun, which you see before him, will be out in December 1st. It's a historical novel, not a David Roby show, about his mother's side of the family, he said. We were all born the same year, Jim and Annick and I, and while we may look a bit weathered by now, what a ride it's been. I first met Jim and Pearl in 1966 when my department chairman suggested I ask them about an apartment in their building. Yes, Jim was teaching here, having just published his first novel, Half of Paradise. After 3 years, his job ran out, and he moved with his family to Miami, where he taught for the next 9 years. Pearl worked as a librarian, at least on and on, I'm not sure about that. I just wanted to add she wasn't sitting home. She wasn't a sitting at home mom looking after those 5 kids. Jim taught at Wichita State and published regularly, but I rarely saw them until they bought a house outside Lolo and began to spend half the year there in 1989. Now they live here full-time, riding their horses, their beautiful horses, and enjoying their children and grandchildren and write. Jim was born in Houston and grew up on the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast. He received a BA in English and an MA from the University of Missouri. Over the years, he worked as a landman for Sinclair Oil Company, a pipeliner, whatever that is, a land surveyor, a newspaper reporter, a college English professor, a social worker on Skid Row in Los Angeles, a clerk for the Louisiana Employment Service, and an instructor in the Kentucky U.S. Job Corps. And he wrote and wrote. He and his wife Pearl met in graduate school and have 4 kids. You may have noticed that his daughter Alifair is also a crime writer with a dozen books of her own. She learned the gift of being prolific. Burke's work has been awarded an Edgar twice for the best crime novel of the year. He has also been a recipient of a Bread Loaf and Guggenheim Fellowships and an NEA grant. You know very few crime writers who are awarded big literary fellowships. This is a fine writer. 2 of his novels, Heaven Prisoner and 2 for Texas, have been made into motion pictures. I loved reading in an article about him that he thought he was dumb as a child. To read him, to listen to him, you know this is one of the smartest guys you've met in range and depth and knowledge. I can't wait to see the new knowledge. Pardon me, the new novel. There's probably new knowledge in it too. In the meantime, for a sampling, please welcome Jimmy Lee Burke.
Thanks very much, all of you, for your kind welcome reception, and thank you, Lois, for that great introduction. And it's an honor to be here also with all of you, and especially Annick, with whom we've been very close friends, as she indicated, for Lordy, it's 49 years now. And Dave, her husband, and Annick and the children used to live in that big log house there on Rock Creek. And Dexter Roberts and I used to always go over there. Remember, Dexter would never get out of the stream till 11 at night. He would have icicles in his beard, literally. And Annick would always feed us and give us coffee, because otherwise, I mean, this would be in November. Anyway, it's great to be here this afternoon. And I appreciate the comments about my intelligence, but that's a very questionable assessment. This is a fact, though. Our daughter, Alifair, graduated at the top of Stanford Law. That's a fact. She has an IQ that is not measurable, literally. There are only 2 in a million that have her level of intelligence. And every time I tell that story to people, they say, "Your wife must be so smart." I mean it. But you know Michael Connelly's work. I was a guest of honor at BoucherCon in Vegas at the Riviera. Have you ever stayed in the Riviera? You don't have to die to go to hell. That's the Riviera. It is like an enormous monument to vulgarity. It's the nicotine in the bath, in the shower, would melt off of the ceiling. It was a yellow rain was coming down on my head, and I didn't know. That's life at the Riviera. Anyway, I thought, well, we're going to weather through this. We had the suite next to Frank Sinatra's suite. We were in the upscale area of the hotel. Inside the restroom was a big wastebasket that had a sign over it for hypodermic needles only. I'm not making this up. Everybody who was there got sick because all of these horrible chemicals are in the air and they recycle it day and night. The rooms are full of smoke. It's ghastly. The mafia got even, brother. Anyway, the point I'm making is, okay, I'm going to receive this award this evening. Michael Conley is going to introduce me, and Michael did. And it was very quiet. He was holding the microphone, and he said, now, I want to introduce someone that many of you know, but probably you're not aware that this man has given one of the greatest gifts we could honor tonight by way of his contribution to the world of crime writing. I'd like to introduce the father of Alifair Burke. I never had to seek humility, it always found me. Okay, this book, Half of Paradise, is part of a trilogy, actually, and it begins in the year 1916 with John Pershing's invasion of Old Mexico. It's based on the members of my mother's family. I don't change the names. My great-grandfather was a drover named Sam Morgan Holland. Oh, he was heck on wheels. He was a saddle preacher, a drunkard, and a gunman. And he killed 9 men. He was a Baptist preacher. People said the congregation always paid attention to his Anyway, his son was Hackberry Holland, and this is the man we meet who is the protagonist in this story. The story is actually based on the biblical account of Ishmael's rejection by his father Abraham, and it also makes use of the search for the Holy Grail, except it's in modern times. I made use of the story of the Knights Templar and the Grail in the shroud. The sun had just crested on the horizon like a misplaced planet, swollen and molten and red, lighting a landscape that seemed sculpted out of clay and soft stone and marked by the fossilized tracks of animals with no names, when a tall, barefoot man wearing little more than rags dropped the horse's reins and eased himself off the horse's back and worked his way down an embankment into a riverbed chained with pools of water that glimmered as brightly as blood in the sunrise. The sand was the color of cinnamon, and spiked with green grass, and felt cool on his feet, even though they were bruised and threaded with lesions that were probably infected. He got to his knees and wiped the bugs off the water and cupped it to his mouth with both hands, then washed his face in it and pushed his long hair out of his eyes. His skin was striped with dirt, his trousers streaked with salt from the dried sweat of the horse. For an instant, he thought he saw his reflection in the surface of the pool. No, that was not he told himself. The narrow face and the shoulder-length hair and the eyes that were like cups of darkness belonged on a tray, or perhaps to a crusader knight left to the mercies of Saracens. "Venga," he said to the horse. "You have to be instructed to drink? It's no compliment to me that the only horse I could steal is probably the dumbest in Pancho Villa's army, a horse that didn't even have the courtesy to wear a saddle." The horse made no reply. "Or is stupidity not the problem?" the man said. "Do you simply consider me an ogre to be feared and avoided? Either way, my sensibilities are fragile right now, and I'd appreciate it if you would get your sorry ass down here." When the horse came down the embankment and began to drink, the man, whose name was Hackberry Holland, sat on a rock and placed his feet in a pool, shutting his eyes, breathing through his nose in the silence. It was a strange place indeed, one the Creator had shaped and beveled and backdropped with mountains that resembled sharks' teeth, then had put away for purposes he did not disclose. There was no bird song, no willow trees swelling with wind, no tinkle of cowbells, no windmill clanking to life, the spout drumming water into a galvanized tank. This was a feral land, its energies as raw and ravenous as a giant predator that ingested the naive and incautious, a place closer to hell than to heaven. He longed for a firearm and a canteen sloshing with water, and a tall crown hat and a pair of boots and soft socks and a clean shirt. It was not a lot to ask. Death was bad only when it was degrading, when it caught you sick and alone and lying on sheets soiled with your smell, your fears assembling around you like specters in the darkness. You see those two strings of smoke up on that mountain? He said to the horse. I suspect those are cook fires built by your former owners, or by banditos that got no use for gringos from Texas. That means we're going to have to cross those mountains north of us, and other than the grass growing in the sand, there's probably not a cup full of feed between here and the Rio Grande. You think you up to that? He rested his palms on his knees. That's what I thought, he said. So I guess the big question is, what are we going to do? The answer is, I got no idea. He stared at the water rippling across the tops of his feet. A great weariness seemed to seep through his body, not unlike a pernicious opiate that told him it was time to rest and not quarrel with his fate. But death was not supposed to come like this, he told himself again. His fingernails were rimmed with dirt, his belt taken from him by his captors, his toes blackened with blood where they had been systematically stomped. He looked up at the sky. They're already circling, he said. They'll take me first, then they'll get to you, poor horse, whether you're breathing or not. I'm sorry it's worked out this way. You didn't do nothing wrong. The horse lifted his head, ears forward, skin wrinkling from a blowfly that had lit on its rump. What is it? Hackberry said. Then he turned his face to a breeze blowing down a slope not over 100 yards away. No, it wasn't simply a breeze. It smelled of mist and trees, perhaps pines and thunderheads forming a lid above canyon walls. It smelled of cave air and fresh water and flowers that bloomed only at night. It smelled of paradise in a mountain desert. You reckon we found Valhalla? It's either that or I'm losing my mind because I hear music. You think you can make the climb up there, old pal? This time, Hackberry didn't wait for a response. He picked up the horse's reins and led him up the embankment on the far side of the riverbed, convinced that his deliverance was at hand. He worked the horse up the incline through the entrance of the canyon and followed a trail around a bend scattered with fallen stone, a paintless one-story Victorian house with the wide veranda and cupolas on the corners and fruit trees and two cisterns in back, was perched on a grassy bench with the voice of Enrico Caruso coming from a gramophone inside. The incongruity of the scene did not end there. A hearse outfitted with brass carriage lamps and scrolled with paintings of white and green lilies and drawn by 4 white horses was parked in front. There were red swords the size of quarters under the animals' harnesses. At least a dozen horses were tethered to a rail and others were picketed in the side yard. Some of the horses wore United States Army saddles. Beer and tequila bottles had been broken on the rocks along the trail that led to the yard. Just as the wind picked up, Hackberry's horse spooked sideways, wall-eyed, pitching its head against the reins. It's all right, boy, Hackberry said. We probably have ridden into a straddle house, although I must admit that hearse is a little out of the ordinary. The horse's nostrils were dilated, ears back. Hackberry dismounted and walked him up the grade, trying to see inside the hearse. Someone had restarted the recording. He could see no one through the windows. Directly above, the clouds had turned a shade of yellow that was almost sulphurous. The wind was cooler and blowing harder, creating a sound in the trees like water rushing through a riverbed. He seemed to have wandered into a magical place that had nothing to do with its surroundings. But he knew, just as the horse did, that sentiments of this kind about Mexico had no credibility and served no purpose. The campesinos were kept poor and uneducated, the police were corrupt, and the aristocracy was possessed of the same arrogance and cruelty that had given the world the Inquisition. Anyone who believed otherwise invited the black arts of both the savage and the imperialist into his life. He gave up on the hearse. The trees in the rear of the house had thick, dark green, waxy leaves and were shadowed by the canyon's walls. But something was wrong with the image, something that didn't fit with the ambiance that Gauguin would have tried to catch with his oils. Hackberry closed and opened and wiped his eyes to make sure his hunger and dysentery had not impaired his vision or released images that he kept walled away in his mind. No, there was no mistaking what had transpired in the canyon, littered by yellow clouds that seemed to billow like thick curds from a chemical factory. 4 black men in army uniforms, 2 of them with their trousers pulled to their ankles, all of them in their socks, their hands bound behind them, had been hanged from the tree limbs, each dying on a separate tree, as though someone had used their death as part of an ornamental display. Hackberry turned the horse in a circle and began leading it back down the slope. "Hey, hombre, ¿a dónde vas?" a man's voice said. A Mexican soldier in a khaki uniform had stepped out on the porch. He was thin and sun-browned and wore a stiff cap with a black bill and a gun belt he had cinched tightly into the flaps of his jacket. He had a narrow face and pits in his skin and teeth that were long and wide set and the color of decayed wood. "You look like a gringo, man," the soldier said. "No hablas español." Hackberry gazed idly around the yard. "I can't even habla inglés," he said. "At least not too good." "You are a funny man." "Not really." Hackberry paused and squinted innocuously at the sky. "What is this place?" "You don't know a casa de citas when you see one, man? How do you like what has been hung in the trees back there?" "I mind my own business and don't study on other people's graves." "You know you got a Mexican brand on your horse?" "I found him out in the desert. If you know the owner, maybe I can give him back. Can you tell me where I am?" "You want to know where you are? You're on a big pile of shit, man." "I don't know why. I don't see myself as much of a threat to nobody. I saw you looking at the hearse. You bothered by corpses, man? Coffins and the like make me uneasy. You're a big liar, man. Those are hurtful words, unkind and unfair, particularly to a man in my circumstances. I'd feel better if you would put that gun back in its holster." "You want to hold my gun, man?" "No, can't say as I do." "Maybe I'll give you the chance. Maybe you might beg to hold my gun. You get what I'm saying, gringo?" The officer's mouth had become lascivious. Hackberry stared at the figures suspended in the trees up the slope, the way the limbs creaked and the figures swayed like shadows when the wind gusted. What'd those colored soldiers do? What did they do? They cried like children. What you think, man? What would you do? Probably the same. Tell you what, I can't pay for food, but I'll chop wood for it. I'd like to feed my horse too, then I'd like to be on my way and forget anything I saw here. The Mexican officer took a toothpick from his shirt pocket and put it in his mouth. His hair was black and thick and shiny and bunched out from under his hat. Some Texas Rangers attacked one of our trains and killed a lot of our people. You heard about that? Hackberry glanced up at the clouds that were roiling like smoke. He rubbed the back of his neck as though he had a crick in it, his pale blue eyes empty. What would provoke them to do such a thing? I'd tell you to ask them, but they're all dead, except one. He got away, a tall man like you. I still can't figure why you hung those colored soldiers. Y'all don't let them use your cat houses? You ever see dead people tied on car fenders, tied on like deer full of holes? Americans did that in the village I come from. I saw it, gringo. The Mexican soldier drew down the skin below his right eye to emphasize the authenticity of his statement. Never heard of that one, Hackberry said. You're a tall gringo, even without boots. If we hang you up, you're going to barely touch the ground. You're going to take a long time dying. I guess that's my bad luck. Before you do that to me, maybe you can help me out on something. Those soldiers back there were members of the 10th or 11th Cavalry. There's a white captain with the 10th. I've been looking for him. You seen a young captain, not quite as tall as me, but with the same features? The Mexican removed the toothpick from his mouth and shook it playfully at Hackberry. You lots of fun, man, but now we're going inside and meet General Lupa. Don't talk shit to him. This is one guy you never talk shit to. You hear me? You're saying he's not quite mature, even though he's a general in your army. That's one way to put it if you want to get your head blown off. The Texas Rangers I'm talking about, they killed his son when they attacked the train. Thank you.
Do you want to know what happens next? Yes. Do you have any other questions? Jimmy Lee, do we really have to wait until December for this to come out?
Yeah, I'm curious to know what happens myself. I belong to the Autistic Savant School of Writing. I never can remember what I write. You know who actually said that? It was, the great trumpet player. What was it? Trumpet player. Miles Davis, when he wrote his autobiography, was on 20 Minutes or 60 Minutes and was asked, really, what do you think of your biography? And he said, I don't know, man. I got to read it and find out.
He's having a good time. Really no questions?
And for James Lee Burke, one of the things that one of your themes that you cover a lot in your books is faith. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering just more about that.
Well, the lady asked about spiritual themes or themes about faith in my work. This book in particular deals with the search for redemption in Hackberry Holland, a man we meet here in the first chapter. And I used the story, as I said, of the search for the Grail. And actually, there are two themes that run throughout my work, from the first book I wrote many years ago up into the present. There are two themes, and they have to do with Golgotha, and the other is the Song of Roland. And it's a great story. I don't know if you read the Ballad of Roland, but it's just a wonderful story of the battle between Charlemagne and supposedly the what do you call them, the Islamic Moors, the Saracens. But in reality, the war was between the Basque, who were, not quite the villainous people they were portrayed in. But anyway, the point is that, it's what I think all Western literature, Occidental literature is about. It's the central theme. On the Road is the prototype of our times. Jack Kerouac, was a devout man, actually. He had a lot of personal problems, but he was a very spiritual guy. Bruce Cook told me this story. He was a journalist on the West Coast and really a fine man. And he wrote this oral history of Jack Kerouac's life. And he went all over the country interviewing everybody who had known Kerouac. And Bruce was a friend of Jack as well. But anyway, Jack was toward the end of his days. It was 1968. He was in terrible shape. He'd gone back to Lowell, Mass, and he was drunk in a bar and he destroyed himself. He only was 47 when he died. But anyway, Jack was talking about something inconsequential, and he suddenly turned to Bruce on the bar stool and he said, "Your art is the Holy Ghost blowing through your soul." That sends chills to me to this day. Yeah. Wow, what a line. And then he started talking about something else that was irrelevant, baseball or something, but what a line. And the funny thing is, my literary career changed with the novel Neon Rain. And Rick DeMarinis, this guy who encouraged me to write it. I couldn't sell Snowballs in Hell through the middle of my career. And I'd gone 13 years without publishing in hardback. I wrote during all that time, and I amassed literally hundreds and hundreds of rejections. Anyway, Rick said, "Why don't you try writing a crime book?" And I thought about it. 3 days later, Pearl and I were in San Fran in North Beach, and I went down to Ferlinghetti's City Lights bookstore, and I bought a yellow legal tablet, and I walked down to this Italian cafe. It's across the street from the Catholic Church there. There's a big green park out there in the middle of the avenue. Anyway, and I sat down and I started writing that in longhand, and I knew it. And I remembered the story about Kerouac, and I wrote the first 2 chapters. I sent them to Charlie Williford, my old compadre in Miami. Charlie wrote back, and he said, "This Dave Robichaux guy you're writing about here is going to become one of the most famous crime figures in crime fiction." I'll never forget. I get chills thinking about this stuff. But I thought about it. Jack Kerouac, Ferlinghetti's bookstore, the church across the street, and Rick DeMarinis. And he changed my life, my career at least. But I didn't mean to run on.
Somebody else ask a question.
Yeah.
See what happens.
Annick, have you found there's a breed of dog you prefer in all your years?
Oh, I love dogs. I love big dogs. I had German Shepherds to begin with. Well, my family, when I was a kid, they had a dachshund. And that cured me of little dogs. So I got a big dog, a German Shepherd, when I was in Seattle, and had a bunch of German Shepherds. And then my granddaughter, Alex's daughter, Jessie, had a lab and a litter, and she gave me one and let me choose it, and that was Bruno. And so then began a life with labs. And I don't know what's next. My Bruno's companion, Lulu, is 12 and a half. She's doing pretty good, but we're both of us getting kind of, we'll see. And if I get another dog, I don't know what it will be. Probably a rescue dog.
Annick, I just spent a couple of weeks out on the Rocky Mountain front, and so your piece really kind of spoke to me. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about east side and west side of Montana and how they complement each other, contradict each other.
Well, they are different worlds. I remember one time going over the top with Jim Welch, and he just said, "Look at that. That's my world." And, that was his world, really. And I came into Montana, into western Montana, and that was my world. But I find that I write about the plains an awful lot. And I'm fascinated with the plains. And I think, it's like yin and yang. The two together make a perfect circle and a perfect combination and perfect world. So I think I can't say I love one more than the other. I think I prefer to live in the country with rivers and mountains, but I love to be on the plains. I live with a man from the plains.
Jim, your novel you just read from set in Mexico, at least part or wholly, makes me want to ask both of you kind of an odd question, who knows where to lead. Do you like to travel to other countries, and if so, which ones do you like, do you prefer, and where, why?
Yeah. Annick was born in Paris. She'd answer that first.
We can hear from you.
Well, I've traveled a little bit. We lived in Mexico a bit, in a little village in the mountains in a very primitive area. In 1961, I learned a lot about, what poverty's like. And I was in Spain a bit during Franco's era. I was at 59, and boy, I saw fascism up front, and boy, all its ugliness. And if you've been in Latin America, the kind of, we give guns to some really nasty people. I've dealt with them, it's frightening. The bravest people on earth, I think, are Maryknolls. I never have understood the level of courage it takes for these guys to go unarmed into a world of people who are morally insane and armed to the teeth and who are allowed to do whatever they wish. Those are the real heroes. They get little recognition.
I have a question, I guess in this case for Annick. Did you find it harder to write a memoir than other types of books you've written before? And maybe just spell out a little bit how you found that.
Well, I think that I'm bitten with the I fever. I tend to write memoirs or first-person essays. Even my stories, shorts fiction, I tend to write in the character's first person sometimes. So no, I don't find it hard. What's hard when you're trying to write memoir or about family or people you know is to be as truthful as you can. That's really hard, is to get beyond your own self-deception and the stories that you grew up with and all that, and sort of try and find your way through that. And of course, my stories are different from my sister's stories, from my kids would tell you different stories, and everyone will believe it's the truth, and it is the truth. So in a lot of ways, fiction and nonfiction are the same. You make a lot of stuff up, and you try and make a good story.
Jim, can I ask you, since I don't believe you've written any memoirs, how do you feel about the opposite side of that?
Lois was asking about writing memoirs. The reason I write stories about other people is because there's nothing worth writing about in my own life, I think. That's not humility either. Look at it this way. Anyone in book publishing will tell you this. people are fascinated with the life of Ernest Hemingway. It doesn't matter what it's about. They will buy a book about Ernest Hemingway. What happens when people write biographies about William Faulkner? It's DOA. And it's just true that most writers are cerebral people who, try to not shoot animals, or put rhino heads, in their den. I had great respect for Hemingway, of course, but he's the only. Fitzgerald is kind of interesting in terms of biography, but it's a sad story. So, boy, did you see this documentary on David Foster Wallace's life? Boy, gee, it's horrifying. It's really depressing. It's a very good documentary, but I don't know. Did you ever read a biography of Tennessee Williams? I mean it. It's, I couldn't finish it because it's too embarrassing. It's his autobiography. I take it back. His autobiography is the kind of book people write about people they hate. And he wrote it. And it's so you get embarrassed. You find yourself blushing, in a commuter train. The things he describes are indescribable. I'm not going to even repeat it. I couldn't finish it, and we didn't have too much money when I bought that book, so I said, I'm not going to throw this away. So I'm going to use the index and read about his relationship to other interesting people. And I looked up, William Faulkner. He met Faulkner, and Tennessee Williams said, I had dinner with Mr. Faulkner 2 nights ago. I do not think he approved of me. And then there's the meeting with Hemingway at the La Florida bar in Havana. Yesterday I had daiquiris with Papa Hemingway. I do not think he approved. You should leave it in Vegas, leave it at home. You know what Kerouac said about a biography? He was interviewed by the Paris Review. He said, what statement would you like me to make as advice to young writers? What have you learned, Jack? He said, always brush your gums and do your drinking at home. That was it.
That's the best art. Is this on? Is this on? Nope. No. Never mind. That was the best argument against the memoir I've ever heard.
We have about 10 more minutes if there are any other questions.
Can you take 10 minutes more? We don't know what to say next.
She's got a paper clip in there. You could be wherever that paper clip is.
What's that paper clip?
What's that paper clip?
Oh, I had marked another chapter, but it's pretty warm in here, you guys. And I don't. Well, how about I tell you a joke instead? This is my father loved to tell jokes. He had the greatest. And I don't know if they were jokes. He'd swear they were true. My favorite was about how intelligence is relative. I said something about what do you mean by relative intelligence? My dad had used that term, and he said, well, my father was a pipeline engineer, a natural gas engineer, and he had pulled into a little country store in Liberty, Texas. It's over in East Texas, and there was an elderly man on the gallery playing checkers with a Cocker Spaniel. So my dad walked up to the elderly man and he said, my heavens, that is the most intelligent dog I have ever seen. And the old man said, I don't think he's so smart. I done beat him 3 games out of 5.
On that note, shall we say thank you and goodbye?